Now, alongside those kind of challenges, we then have some other kind of very interesting developments going on around aging. One is that we now map the human genome. We understand the genetic structure of humans. The geneticists working on this have also started to look at the building blocks of genes, which are called proteins. People are thinking, hang on, it's 5 to 11 and he's talking about genetics. But what they've discovered is that there's a worm that they can look at that has a very similar protein structure to humans. And one of the things they found is a protein that controls the aging process in that worm. And when they switch off that protein, it extends the life of the worm by 3 to 5 times. They now think they've found the same protein in humans. How do you motivate a 190-year-old salesperson? What do you buy your partner for their 200th birthday? Think about marriage. Some of us struggle with the idea of a 60-year contract. Imagine the words "I do" signing you up for 200. And for the women in the room, imagine having to put the toilet seat down for 200 years. I told you I don't do after dinner. And then then the kind of situation gets even more interesting when you look at the work of a guy called Aubrey de Grey, a geneticist from Cambridge. He argues that the first person to live to 1,000 could already be 60 years old. Because what he's saying is if you look at what's going on in medical science, there could be a whole series of developments in that person's life that extend their lives by 30 to 60 to 100 years at a time. What do you do about that one? Bugger if I know. But on the people living to 100, people living to 120, this creates an opportunity. It is a really underserved segment of society. The services they need, the lives they lead, they don't want adverts talking to them about how old they are and how they can have saga holidays. They want all sorts of interesting services. They're quite a wealthy group, and there's a huge set of opportunities there. The second issue I want to talk about is going broader than just the UK society and talk about demographics on the planet. Last year we passed a milestone where we had more people living in urban areas than in rural areas for the first time, over 3 billion. The planet as a whole is going to go, if you look at what's happening in the next 40 years, the US will grow by about 100 million, Latin America will grow by about 250 million, Europe will shrink by 100 million, Africa will grow by about 1 billion people, which is incredible given that average male life expectancy in Africa is 31, and Asia will grow by 1.6 billion people. Asia is already 60% of the planet's population, so Asia will grow by more than the entire population of North America, Latin America, and Europe combined. At the same time, what we're seeing is those populations being taken out of poverty on a long-term basis. So China's taken 400 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years, India about 150 million. We're seeing the economies of Africa, of Asia, of the Middle East now starting to move themselves onto a very different track, which is why people are talking about this being the Asian century. They're starting to become self-sufficient, they're starting to decouple from the Western world, and we're seeing a very different set of opportunities emerging there. The issue for companies in the West is how do we take part in that? It's no longer just about cheap outsourcing or offshoring. This is about huge consumer markets emerging, huge opportunities. If we look at the stock markets in the world last year, of the 10 stock markets that grew the largest, 6 were in Asia, 3 were in the Middle East, 1 was in Latin America. They grew between about 38% and 111%. Most of us here have pensions which are partly invested in the UK. The FT 100 grew by 2%, and the US stock market shrank by 1%. If you were really smart, you'd have invested in Zimbabwe, which grew by 331,000%, but given hyperinflation, it would still only be worth about 12p. Interesting is also what's going to happen within Europe. That 100 million, most of the countries in Europe are going to shrink. Russia by about 25%, most of the old Eastern Bloc by about 30%. The UK is one of the few countries that's going to grow. It's going to grow from about 60 million to 67 million. Almost all of that is going to be migrants. If you look at what's going to happen between now and 2050, the estimates are that between Africans and Asians migrating to Europe, there'll be about 1.6 million a year. You either kind of take the Daily Mail view, which is, oh, isn't this a disaster, or you take the Economist view, which is migration drives innovation, drives wealth creation. And you start to say, hang on, maybe there's a whole set of services we can offer to those people around accommodation, around training, around culture, everything that they need to come to Europe. and maybe we start to look at putting operations in their countries to help them come, to help service them, and start to see that as an opportunity rather than a threat. And again, it's your choice how you look at it. Now, I've touched on kind of the rise of the emerging economies, but what we are seeing now is the rise of some very vibrant economies. China's the 4th biggest economy in the world, India the 9th biggest. China's on course to be the biggest economy in the world by 2020. But it's not just China and India. If we look at the map of who the biggest economies in the world will be in the next 20 years, you're starting to see countries like Bangladesh, the Philippines, Nigeria, Pakistan, all emerging onto that list. And what we're seeing is when you go to these countries, you're seeing companies from all over the world who are at the forefront, who see themselves as leaders, getting in there early to invest in those economies, to develop services, to develop partnerships. Let me leave you in no doubt, it is not easy doing business in China, doing business in India, doing business in Pakistan. But there are huge opportunities, and there's never a better time than now when the world is possibly moving into recession, to start looking at some of these economies that are growing very fast. One of the things that people say is you can't possibly be serious about Pakistan, because the only thing we kind of know about Pakistan at the moment is the issue of terrorism and the president, Musharraf, who's invented this new form of democracy where you can vote for anyone so long as they're called Musharraf. His opponents keep dying, which is kind of a really strange set of accidents, but nothing to do with him, of course. And we're saying to people, really start to look at this and do the research, use the social networks, use the tools that are out there to start learning about these economies and the opportunities that exist there. Let me move on then. So beyond the vibrant economies, we also have a question about, well, how does the overall economy look? What does the global economy look like in the next few years? And again, what most of us do is we have one scenario in our head, one set of assumptions about the way the world's going to play out, and that's what we base our plans on. And quite often that's kind of hope. We hope that what we've written down is going to play out so we can achieve our goals. But one of the things Shell found in the 80s was that actually if you looked at a range of different possibilities of what the future might look like, you could rehearse the future and you could have a set of plans for a range of different possible outcomes. And what we find is with the most innovative businesses and successful businesses around the world that we see, they're doing that. They're trying out different possible thoughts. One of the things Shell looked at was, under one scenario, what if the oil price drops from what was $30 a barrel to $4 a barrel? And one of the things they said was, if that happens, we'd go out and we'd change all our processes so we could make money at $4 a barrel. And someone in the room said, well, why don't we do that anyway? Why don't we do that now while it's $30 a barrel? And so you find when you start to look at the future, all sorts of interesting ideas come out. So we think there's 4 different scenarios you should prepare for. The first is, everything in the garden's rosy. Europe, the US, Japan keep growing at 2 to 3%. China and India keep growing at 8 to 10%. The developing world's pulled along behind them, and there's lots of opportunity. That's the kind of optimistic scenario. The second one is one where Europe, the US, and Japan slow down to about 1% growth, which is kind of what's happening now. China and India keep going at 8 to 10%, and the developing world really start to focus in much more on China and India as their core partners. And you start to see a lot of trade tensions between the two. Third scenario is one where basically growth in the Europe, the US, and Japan stalls. You get 0 growth. China and India slow down a bit, and you get some developing economies start to struggle. Fourth scenario is where we go into a recession, possibly induced by the credit crisis, and China and India slow right down. You start to see some developing economies fail and be forced to merge. What we say to people is don't pick one. Don't say let's look for the one we like best and plan for that. Think about how your business, whatever you do, whether you're a one-person player or you're a multinational company, what would the implications be for you under each of those different scenarios? Because we think all 4 are possible. If we look at what's happened with the subprime crisis, at the moment the estimates are that it's costing investment banks between $250 and $400 billion. The investment banks are sitting on potentially $2 trillion worth of other products and dodgy products based on those subprime mortgages, which could all turn to CAC, which is a technical term from the investment bankers.